Picture an ordinary morning in a city you know well. People crossing the street, waiting for coffee, scrolling their phones. Now picture one of them just a little differently built. A heavier brow, a broader chest, shorter limbs. A face made for a colder, harder world. Not a costume, not a reenactor. A living Neanderthal, walking among us, doing exactly what everyone else is doing. That's not a fantasy scenario pulled from nowhere. For most of human history, that world actually existed. Two different kinds of humans shared the same forests, the same rivers, the same hunting grounds, for tens of thousands of years. The only reason it sounds strange to imagine now is that one side of that story ended, and we were the ones left standing to write it. So tonight we're asking a very specific kind of question. Not, what were Neanderthals like? We already know a surprising amount about that. The real question is stranger and closer to home. What if they never went extinct at all? What would it actually look like if Neanderthal communities were still out there today? And how would that change what it even means to be human? Let's start with what we actually know, because the popular image of Neanderthals is almost entirely wrong. For a long time, Neanderthals were drawn as hunched, slow-witted brutes, barely smarter than the animals they hunted. That image came from an early fossil skeleton that turned out to have severe arthritis, which bent the whole reconstruction, and from a century of scientists assuming that anything different from us must be lesser. Neither of those things holds up anymore. Neanderthals lived across Europe and parts of Western Asia for roughly 400,000 years, disappearing from the fossil record around 40,000 years ago. Their brains were, on average, slightly larger than ours are today. Not smaller, larger. They made complex stone tools, controlled fire, wore clothing stitched from animal hide, and treated their injured and sick well enough that skeletons have been found with healed fractures that would have required weeks of care from other members of the group just to survive. They buried their dead. In more than one site, archaeologists have found bodies placed deliberately in the ground, sometimes with flowers or tools nearby. Behavior that strongly suggests some form of ritual, some form of meaning attached to death, not just disposal. That's not something you'd expect from a primitive species. That's something you'd expect from people. Take the famous case from Shanidar Cave, in what's now northern Iraq. Decades ago, researchers pulled pollen clusters from around a buried Neanderthal skeleton and floated the idea that the body had been laid to rest with flowers. That specific detail has been debated back and forth for years. Some scientists think burrowing animals may have carried the pollen in long after burial, but the debate itself says something important. We're not arguing about whether Neanderthals could have done something like that. We're arguing about the details of exactly how they did it. Nobody serious in the field is arguing they were incapable of it in the first place. Their toolmaking tells a similar story. Neanderthals used something archaeologists call the Levallois technique, a method of striking a prepared stone core in a precise sequence to consistently produce sharp, predictable flakes. That's not random smashing. That takes planning several steps ahead, an understanding of how a material will break before you ever touch it. Some sites have even turned up small amounts of pigment and shell ornaments that appear to have been deliberately shaped or pierced, hinting at personal decoration, something we usually associate with identity and self-expression, not just survival. And here's the detail that changes the entire emotional weight of this story. Neanderthals and modern humans didn't just live near each other. They had children together. If you're of non-African descent, somewhere between 1 and 2% of your own DNA likely traces directly back to Neanderthal ancestors. That's not a metaphor. That's not a rough comparison. It's sitting in your genome right now, in genes linked to skin pigmentation, immune response, and even how some people process pain. In a very literal sense, Neanderthals never fully went extinct. They just stopped existing as a separate population because they were absorbed into ours. So why did the separate line disappear at all? For years, the answer people reached for was violence, that modern humans simply outcompeted or wiped out a slower, weaker cousin. The actual research paints a messier and more interesting picture.
Neanderthal populations were small and scattered to begin with, likely never numbering more than a few tens of thousands of individuals across the entire continent at any one time. Small populations are fragile. They're more vulnerable to disease, more vulnerable to a few bad winters in a row, more vulnerable to slow genetic problems that build up when groups can't easily mix with others far away. At roughly the same time, the climate was swinging wildly. Sudden cold spells, followed by warming, followed by cold again, faster than ecosystems could comfortably adjust. Modern humans arriving from Africa carried larger social networks, more complex trade and communication across long distances, and possibly better cold weather technology suited to a rapidly shifting world. It likely wasn't a single dramatic war that ended things. It was thousands of years of small disadvantages stacking up, generation after generation, until the numbers simply couldn't recover. Genome studies back this up in an unsettling, quiet way. When researchers sequenced a fairly complete Neanderthal genome, they found signs consistent with a long history of small, inbred groups, reduced genetic diversity, the kind of pattern you see in populations that have been isolated and shrinking for a long time already, even before modern humans show up in large numbers nearby. In other words, part of the extinction story may have already been written into their biology well before the final chapter, the same way a population of any species with too few unrelated members to mix with tends to slowly lose resilience over time, one hard season at a time. Now, here's where we take that real history and bend it. What if one Neanderthal population didn't stack up those disadvantages? What if a group survived in a place isolated enough, a mountain range, a remote forest system, a region modern humans didn't reach and settle for thousands of additional years, and simply kept going, generation after generation, largely undisturbed? Places like the Caucasus Mountains, parts of remote Siberia, or dense forest systems in what's now northern Europe offer exactly the kind of geographic isolation that could, in theory, let a small population persist far longer than the ones we have fossil evidence for. We're not talking about cave-dwelling monsters hiding from civilization in a horror movie sense. We're talking about a distinct human population, culturally and technologically capable, simply existing outside the reach of the large agricultural civilizations that eventually spread across the rest of the world. If that population survived into the modern era, the first and most important thing to understand is that they would not be less human in any meaningful sense. Genetically, Neanderthals and modern humans are close enough that we already interbred successfully, meaning any surviving population would almost certainly be capable of speech, complex culture, tool use, and long-term social planning, just shaped by a different evolutionary path and possibly a very different set of traditions built up over tens of thousands of extra years in isolation. It also raises a very specific, slightly uncomfortable biological question that would move from theoretical to real almost overnight. Could modern humans and a surviving Neanderthal population still have children together today? Based on the ancient interbreeding evidence we already have, the honest scientific answer is probably yes, at least in many cases. The genetic distance between the two groups roughly 40,000 years ago clearly wasn't large enough to prevent fertile offspring, and tens of thousands of additional years of separate evolution, while significant, may not have been enough on its own to close that door completely. That single fact alone would turn abstract identity questions into immediate, deeply personal ones for any families formed across that line. This is where the story stops being about biology and starts being about something much harder to sit with: what humanity would actually do with that discovery. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Throughout history, whenever explorers, colonizers, or dominant societies encountered other groups of humans who looked, spoke, or lived differently, the default response was rarely curiosity and respect. It was almost always some version of, "These people are lesser," followed by exploitation, displacement, or violence. If a distinct population of Neanderthals were discovered alive today, the honest, uncomfortable question is whether modern society would actually treat them as equals, or whether the oldest, ugliest instincts in human history would simply repeat themselves on a new target.
Legally, it would create chaos almost nobody has a real framework for. Human rights law is built entirely around the assumption that there is one species making the rules and being protected by them. Would a surviving Neanderthal population be granted full citizenship, land rights, and legal personhood? Would they be studied first and protected second, the way many indigenous human populations were treated by anthropologists throughout the 20th century, sometimes respectfully, but often not? International law has no existing category for a different but closely related human species, because until this hypothetical, nobody has needed one in living memory. Think about how fast the practical scramble would move too. Whichever country's territory the population was found in would suddenly hold what every research institution, pharmaceutical company, and media network on the planet would want access to. Governments would face immediate pressure to declare the discovery a matter of national sovereignty before international bodies could even convene a meeting about it. Universities would compete for research access the way space agencies once competed over the moon. And within days, camera crews, journalists, and no doubt a wave of amateur influencers would be trying to get close enough for a photo, creating exactly the kind of chaotic, unregulated first contact that no ethics board would ever approve of if there were time to plan it properly. There's also a slower, quieter economic angle worth considering. Once initial shock settled into some kind of normalized coexistence, entire new industries could plausibly form around it. Specialized medical research given their genetic closeness to us, cultural and language documentation projects, protected heritage tourism handled with the same seriousness as isolated indigenous territories today, and almost certainly new legal specializations built specifically to handle cross-species or cross-population, citizenship, and property questions that no law book currently has an answer for. Scientifically, the discovery would be almost impossible to overstate. Every major open question in human evolution, how language actually developed, how symbolic thought and religion first emerged, what a fundamentally different but comparably intelligent mind experiences, could suddenly have living answers instead of only fossil guesses. Genetics labs that currently piece together Neanderthal traits from fragments of ancient bone would instead have access to a living, breathing population to study directly, which raises its own immediate ethical alarm. How do you study a group of intelligent, self-aware people without treating them like specimens instead of neighbors? That single ethical question would likely split the scientific community almost immediately. One camp would push for rapid, thorough study, arguing that the knowledge gained could reshape medicine, linguistics, and evolutionary biology for generations.
Another camp would push back hard, pointing to the long, ugly history of researchers treating unfamiliar human populations as objects of curiosity rather than people with their own right to privacy, autonomy, and consent. There's no clean answer here, and that's exactly the point. The moment biology hands us a real-world case this close to home, our usual categories for subject versus person stop working cleanly. Culturally, it might do something even more interesting than any legal or scientific outcome. It could force modern humans to finally define, out loud and with real consequences attached, what human actually means. For all of history, we've used that word casually, assuming there's only one possible answer sitting inside it. A living Neanderthal population wouldn't just challenge biology textbooks. It would challenge the entire unspoken assumption that intelligence, culture, and dignity only exist in exactly one shape. There's also a strange kind of mirror in this scenario that's easy to miss. We already know, beyond any doubt, that a piece of them survived, quietly, invisibly, inside almost every non-African person alive today. The thought experiment of a fully surviving population isn't really asking, what if something completely alien joined our world? It's asking, what if the version of us that we already carry inside our own DNA had simply been allowed to keep walking beside us in the open, instead of only surviving in fragments we can't see? So, picture that morning street scene one more time. The person with the heavier brow and the broader frame isn't a stranger from another world. In the genetic sense, they're closer to being a distant relative who took a different road a very long time ago. One who might have kept walking that road right up until today, if a handful of hard winters, a few thousand fewer individuals, and a slightly slower spread of new ideas had gone just a little differently.
That's the real weight of this question. It's not about imagining some other species suddenly showing up. It's about realizing how thin the line actually was between extinct 40,000 years ago and still standing next to us in line for coffee. And how much of what we assume makes us uniquely human might just be a story that survived, instead of a fact that was inevitable. If a population that close to us could vanish from a few thousand hard years, it raises a much bigger question we haven't touched yet. How many other close calls has our own species already survived without even realizing how close we came to disappearing ourselves? That's exactly where we're headed next time on Otherwise, into the moments our own species almost didn't make it through at all. Subscribe and find out just how thin that line really was.